Most people throw this away without even thinking. After every fire, every barbecue, every winter night by the fireplace, it's just left there, gray, useless, something to clean up and forget. But a long time ago, people didn't throw it away. They saved it because they knew something we don't. When crops started failing, when the soil turned weak, when food became uncertain, this was one of the first things they reached for. Not water, not tools, not anything from a store, just this. A powder so simple, most people today would laugh if you told them it could change an entire harvest. And yet, for generations, it did exactly that. Fields that should have struggled didn't. Plants that should have died kept growing. And the strangest part, it wasn't rare, it wasn't expensive, it wasn't even hard to make. It was already there, sitting in plain sight. So what changed? Why did something so simple, something so effective, quietly disappear from the way we grow food today? And more importantly, if people once relied on this to grow food in harsh conditions, what happens if you bring it back? Long before anything came in bags or bottles, people understood one simple rule: waste nothing. When a fire burned down, what was left behind wasn't seen as trash. It was saved, collected, sometimes stored in barrels, sometimes kept in small piles near the edge of a field. Because that gray powder wasn't just the end of a fire, it was part of a cycle. Wood became flame, flame became ash, and ash went back into the soil. Over time, this became instinct. No manuals, no instructions, just repetition passed from one generation to the next. After cooking, the ash was kept. After clearing land, the ash was spread. After every burn, the soil was fed. People didn't question it. They didn't analyze it. They just saw the results. Soil that stayed soft instead of turning hard. Crops that came back stronger instead of weaker. Land that kept producing season after season without needing anything brought in from the outside, even in places where the ground was naturally poor. This made a difference, not overnight, but steadily, reliably. It was one of those quiet practices that didn't look impressive, but changed everything over time. And because it was so simple, it never needed explaining. It just became part of how things were done until one day it wasn't, and most people didn't even notice it was gone. It didn't disappear all at once. It faded quietly, like something people slowly forgot they ever needed. And once it was gone, something else had to take its place. Something people had to start buying instead. Here's where things get interesting, because this wasn't just a random habit people followed. It worked for a reason. When soil starts to fail, it doesn't just lose nutrients. It loses structure. It becomes tight, dry, and lifeless. Water runs off instead of sinking in. Roots struggle to spread. And even when you add water, it doesn't stay where it's needed. That's when most people think the solution is more water. But the real problem is the soil itself. That gray powder people used for generations changes how soil behaves. It loosens it. It breaks that hard, dry surface and makes it easier for water to sink in instead of disappearing. At the same time, it feeds the soil in a way that doesn't overwhelm it. Instead of dumping everything at once, it slowly releases what plants need right where their roots are. And that's what makes the difference during dry conditions. Because when water is limited, the soil has to do more of the work. It has to hold moisture longer. It has to stay active instead of turning into dust. It has to support roots even when conditions are harsh. This is where most modern methods struggle. They depend on constant input, more water, more products, more intervention. But this old method works with the soil instead of against it. It strengthens it from the ground up, so even when conditions aren't ideal, plants don't collapse as quickly. They hold on longer, they grow steadier, and in some cases, they keep going when everything around them starts to fail. That's why, in difficult seasons, this wasn't just helpful, it was something people relied on, because when everything else became uncertain, this was one of the few things that stayed consistent. And once you understand that, you start to see why it mattered so much. And then slowly, people stopped. Not all at once. Not in some dramatic moment where everything changed overnight. It happened quietly, the way most things do. New solutions started appearing. Easier ones, faster ones, things you didn't have to think about. You didn't have to collect anything, didn't have to store it, didn't have to remember what your parents or grandparents used to do. You could just go somewhere, pick something up, and be done with it. And over time, that changed something deeper than just the tools people used. It changed how they thought. Instead of looking at what they already had, people started looking for what they could buy. Instead of working with the land, they started depending on something outside of it. And slowly, that old habit, the one that took almost no effort, cost nothing, and worked quietly in the background, started to feel unnecessary, outdated, even useless. The less people used it, the less they talked about it. The less they talked about it, the more it faded, until eventually, it wasn't something you learned anymore. It wasn't something you were taught. It wasn't even something you questioned. It just disappeared from everyday thinking. And once that happens, something strange switch takes place. People begin to believe that what replaced it is the only way things have ever worked, that if it's not packaged, labeled, and sold, it can't possibly be effective. Now think about what happens when things go wrong. Not just a bad week, not just a missed watering, but a real dry stretch. Days turn into weeks. The soil loses whatever moisture it had left. The surface hardens, cracks start to form, and no matter how much you pour on top, it disappears almost instantly. This is where most gardens fail, because at that point, it's no longer about how much water you add. It's about what the soil can hold. Weak soil can't hold anything. It dries faster. It overheats. It stops supporting life below the surface. Roots stop spreading. Growth slows down. And eventually, everything starts to fade. But soil that has been built up differently reacts differently. Instead of hardening, it stays loose. Instead of rejecting water, it absorbs it. Instead of losing everything in a day, it holds on to what little it gets. And that's where this simple method makes a real difference, because it prepares the soil before things get bad. It gives it structure, it gives it balance. So when water becomes scarce, the soil doesn't panic, it adapts. Plants don't grow wildly in those conditions, but they don't collapse either. They survive longer, they stay stable, and sometimes that's the difference between losing everything and still having something left to harvest. That's why people didn't wait for problems to start using this. They used it early, they used it consistently, because when dry seasons came, and they always did, this was already working beneath the surface, quietly holding everything together. So what do you actually do with this? It's simpler than most people expect. After a fire, whether it's from a fireplace, a campfire, or even cooking, what's left behind is what you're looking for, that fine gray ash. The key is keeping it clean. Only natural wood, no treated lumber, no painted scraps, nothing artificial. Once it cools completely, you don't need much. A light layer over your soil is enough. Spread it gently, mix it into the top layer, let it become part of the ground instead of sitting on top of it. That's it. No complicated process, no precise measurements needed to get started, just consistency. Used over time, it builds something you can't buy in a bag. Stronger soil, more resilient growth, and a system that doesn't depend on constant input, because in the end, this was never really about a secret trick. It was about understanding what was already there, what people once used without thinking, and what most people today overlook completely. So the next time you see that gray powder sitting at the bottom of a fire, don't throw it away, because that might be the one thing your soil has been missing all along. And if this changed how you see something as simple as ash, subscribe and like the video, because there's more hidden in plain sight than most people realize.